They always assume that someone like me, wearing a cheap coat and working the night shift, does not know how to play chess. They are wrong. Sometimes, the woman standing silently in the darkest corner of the auditorium, swallowing her tears, is the exact person holding the switch that can bring down their entire empire. Never cross a mother who has sacrificed her last drop of blood and sweat to protect her child. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Delilah. At 42 years old, standing before the sprawling, imposing glass doors of the Summit Ridge Private High School auditorium, I felt an overwhelming sense of displacement. The late afternoon sun reflected off the pristine, polished architecture, casting long shadows that seemed to deliberately highlight my inadequacies. In my trembling hands, I held a small terracotta pot containing a rare black petunia. It was not something bought from a high-end florist. I had spent 6 agonizingly careful months cultivating it from a tiny, fragile seed in the corner of my damp garage, coaxing the dark, velvety petals to bloom just in time for this exact evening. It was a temperamental flower, requiring precise amounts of water and light, much like the delicate hope I had nurtured for my son. I adjusted the collar of my navy blue thrift store blazer. I had spent over an hour ironing it the night before, pressing out every stubborn wrinkle until the cheap synthetic fabric was uncomfortably stiff, desperately praying it could pass for something respectable. My worn-out shoes, their heels scuffed raw from years of standing on concrete warehouse floors, were carefully hidden beneath the hem of my trousers. Around me, the courtyard was a sea of effortless wealth. Sleek, whisper-quiet electric vehicles glided to the valet stand, their doors opening to reveal parents who looked like they had stepped directly out of a luxury magazine. Women brushed past me, leaving trails of heavy, expensive perfumes, their custom silk dresses and tailored suits a stark, humiliating contrast to my faded attire. I was a ghost haunting a world I did not belong to, a solitary weed in an immaculately manicured forest of plastic and privilege. Taking a deep breath, I pulled out my shattered screen phone. The brightness was turned all the way down to save the failing battery, but the text message from my 18-year-old son, Leo, glowed brightly in my mind. I read the words for the 100th time that day. Row 1, Seat A. That seat is the reward I have for you. A small, weary smile touched my lips, softening the harsh lines that exhaustion had carved into my face. After everything we had endured, after all the sleepless nights, the unpaid bills, and the tears swallowed in silence, we had finally made it. He was graduating. I stepped through the grand double doors and navigated the plush carpet toward the front of the massive hall. The front row was cordoned off with velvet ropes, marked clearly for VIPs. I approached row 1, my heart fluttering with a rare sense of pride, only to feel the blood drain completely from my face. There, sitting casually in seat A, was Meredith, my ex-husband's new wife. She was draped in a $3,000 off-the-shoulder designer gown that clung to her perfectly sculpted frame, a dress that cost more than I made in 3 months of heavy lifting. Her diamond necklace caught the stage lights, casting arrogant little glimmers across the carpeted aisle. I froze, clutching the terracotta pot tighter to my chest. Meredith noticed me. She did not flinch. Instead, she deliberately crossed her legs, slowly raking her gaze over me from the top of my outdated haircut down to the frayed hem of my trousers. The disdain in her eyes was palpable, a physical weight pressing down on my lungs. She leaned slightly toward the aisle, blocking my path, and let out a soft, mocking scoff. "This seat is for the real family," she said, her voice a poisonous whisper designed to carry just far enough to humiliate me. She flicked her manicured fingers toward the back of the room. The standby section is way in the back. I shifted my gaze to the man sitting right next to her. Julian, my ex-husband, the father of the boy about to cross that stage. He was staring intensely at the glossy event program in his hands, aggressively pretending to read the fine print, too much of a coward to even meet my eyes. His perfectly tailored suit mocked the poverty he had abandoned me to. The bitter lump of pure humiliation swelled in my throat, threatening to choke me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear the program from his hands. But then I thought of Leo. This was his night. I would not let their cruelty ruin my son's triumph. Swallowing the sharp taste of defeat, I turned around. I clutched my black petunia and began the long, humiliating walk back down the aisle, retreating to the standing room area at the very back of the auditorium, a crowded, stifling corner where the air conditioning did not even reach. Standing in the suffocating heat of the standing room, watching the oblivious elite fan themselves with glossy programs, the smell of expensive cologne suddenly made me nauseous. It was the exact scent Julian used to wear. The aroma acted as a violent time machine, ripping me away from the bright lights of the auditorium and dragging me back to the darkest abyss of my life. 8 years ago. The year my reality was entirely dismantled and meticulously rebuilt with bruised hands and raw fury. The memory of his departure was not a faded photograph. It was a jagged piece of glass that still cut when touched. Julian did not just walk out the door to chase after Meredith, a high-profile interior designer whose entire existence revolved around velvet upholstery and superficial aesthetics. He executed a calculated financial slaughter. He spent months funneling the assets of his supposedly struggling tech startup into offshore shell companies, manipulating the ledgers until the business looked like a barren wasteland on paper. When the divorce proceedings began, he stood before the judge in a bespoke suit and declared bankruptcy with the practiced sincerity of a sociopath. The court system, blind to his accounting illusions, bought the tragic narrative of a failed entrepreneur. I walked out of that courtroom with absolutely nothing. $0, no house, no savings, no safety net. Julian walked straight into a luxury penthouse with his new muse, leaving behind a shattered family like a discarded rough draft. But the absolute betrayal was not the stolen money. It was his monstrous cruelty toward our son. Leo was 10 years old at the time, drowning daily in a terrifying ocean of scrambled letters and backwards numbers. Severe dyslexia. The school system was utterly ill-equipped to handle him, and the educators demanded we hire specialized, intensive tutoring that cost an astronomical amount of money per hour. Desperate, I went to Julian. I stood in the lobby of his pristine new corporate building, begging him to unlock just a fraction of the hidden funds to save our boy's future. Julian looked down at me, his eyes entirely devoid of warmth. Then, he looked at Leo, who was nervously twisting the hem of his shirt, terrified of his own father. "I am not pouring my hard-earned capital down the drain for a reject," Julian had sneered, his voice dropping into a register of pure venom. "He cannot even read a simple sentence. He is defective. Investing in him is a complete waste of resources." He turned his back and walked through the sliding glass doors, leaving his 10-year-old son crying silently on the cold marble floor. That was the exact moment the frightened housewife inside me died, and something much more dangerous took her place. I needed money, and I needed it immediately. Without a college degree or a resume filled with corporate buzzwords, the gleaming office towers of the city were locked to me. I turned to the only place that did not ask questions and paid double for the graveyard shift, the cavernous, windowless warehouse of Novatech Logistics. For 12 agonizing hours every single night, I entered a concrete hell. I learned to operate heavy forklifts, hauling massive wooden pallets of industrial equipment across the freezing, dust-choked floors. I threw my small frame against crates that weighed more than I did. It was back-breaking, soul-crushing labor designed to grind the human body into dust. The physical toll was immediate and brutal. My hands, once soft, transformed into hardened weapons. Deep blisters formed across my palms, eventually rupturing and turning into open wounds. Because I could not afford to take a single night off, the open wounds hardened into thick, cracked calluses that frequently bled into the lining of my rough canvas work gloves. Every muscle in my back screamed in relentless agony. Yet every heavy box I lifted was another hour of specialized reading therapy for Leo. Every drop of sweat was a down payment on his dignity. I would clock out at 6 a.m, my body trembling from exhaustion, and drive my rusted, rattling sedan back to our tiny rented apartment. The inescapable, pungent stench of heavy motor oil, industrial grease, and stale sweat clung to my skin, my hair, my very soul. It was a smell that could not be washed away, no matter how hard I scrubbed. But there was absolutely no time to collapse into bed. I would stand at the chipped laminate kitchen counter, violently scrubbing my raw hands with harsh abrasive soap, before turning on the unreliable stove to cook eggs and toast for Leo. I made sure to smile, hiding the debilitating fatigue behind a mask of unwavering strength, because my son needed a warrior, not a victim. Despite the expensive tutoring, the traditional educational system continued to crush Leo's spirit. Letters remained his enemies. So I decided we needed a completely new language. We transformed our drafty, uninsulated, single-car garage into a sanctuary of creation. It became our secret laboratory. I took fractions of my meager paycheck to pawn shops and junkyards, buying broken electronics, discarded household appliances, and a cheap soldering iron. If the world of two-dimensional text was going to reject him, I would teach him to conquer the three-dimensional world of mechanics. I spent hundreds of hours in that freezing garage with him. I taught him how to strip copper wires, how to trace complex circuit boards, and how to understand the physical mechanics of energy. We dismantled engines and rebuilt them from scratch. I stood beside him in my heavy winter coat, my breath turning to white mist in the freezing air, holding the heavy flashlight steady for him until my fingers went completely numb. In that garage, the frustration finally melted from his eyes. He realized his brain was not broken at all. It was a magnificent engine that mapped the world in pure spatial logic. He possessed a mechanical genius that traditional tests could not measure. His dyslexia was not a curse. It was a unique operating system, and I was determined to help him write the code. While we were huddled in that grease-stained garage breathing in toxic solder fumes, the outside world kept spinning in its orbit of superficiality. Occasionally, during my 15-minute breaks at the warehouse, a well-meaning but utterly tone-deaf coworker would thrust a glowing phone screen into my face, showing me the curated social media feeds of Julian and Meredith. The digital squares were a relentless exhibition of extreme, nauseating wealth. "Magical winter getaway in Aspen," the captions read. There were high-resolution photographs of them clinking crystal champagne flutes in a private, mahogany-paneled ski lodge, swathed in thousands of dollars worth of designer winter gear, sporting perfect, carefree smiles. They were completely oblivious, intentionally and violently erasing the existence of the struggling child they had left behind. They were living in a glittering illusion, fully believing they had won. Julian had discarded us like defective, useless prototypes, assuming we would simply rust away in the dark. But as I stood there in the warehouse, wiping machine grease from my bleeding hands, I knew his arrogance was his fatal flaw. He severely underestimated the terrifying endurance of the working class. More importantly, he had no idea that while he was busy building a house of cards on stolen money, I was teaching the son he abandoned how to build a machine that would eventually tear it all down. A sharp burst of white light snapped me back to the suffocating present. Down at the front of the auditorium, where the climate control system hummed quietly to maintain a perfect temperature for silk and cashmere, the local press had gathered in a tight swarm. The ceremony was officially underway. heralded by the droning voice of the school principal echoing through a state-of-the-art surround sound system. But the real spectacle was not on the stage. It was deeply entrenched in the VIP section. Two hired photographers, their lenses as long as my arm, hovered around Julian like sycophantic moths drawn to a neon sign. Every single time he offered a perfectly practiced, solemn nod to the speaker, a cascade of camera flashes erupted, illuminating his sharp jawline. From my vantage point in the sweltering, crowded back corner, wedged uncomfortably between a load-bearing concrete pillar and a restless janitorial cart, the entire scene played out like a grotesque, overproduced theatrical performance. The air back here was thick, smelling of nervous sweat and cheap floor wax, a stark contrast to the subtle floral notes drifting up from the front rows. The principal cleared his throat, his amplified voice dripping with an exaggerated reverence that made my stomach physically turn. He began to speak about the pinnacle event of the evening, the inaugural Future Innovator Grant. He described it as a beacon of philanthropic excellence, a shining testament to corporate social responsibility in our modern age. Then, he announced the prize money, $50,000. A collective murmur of polite awe rippled through the audience of wealthy parents, as if they did not spend that exact amount on summer vacations to Europe. What the principal conveniently failed to mention, and what I knew with absolute chilling certainty, was the meticulously engineered reality behind this sudden burst of extravagant generosity. Julian's tech firm was the sole exclusive sponsor of this brand new award. It was not an act of charity. It was a calculated business expense written off on his corporate taxes. Julian was currently gearing up for a massive Series C funding round. His venture capitalist investors were demanding not just raw profitability, but a robust, socially conscious public image to appease the modern market. His aggressive public relations team had orchestrated this entire charade down to the second. What could possibly look better on the glossy cover of a prominent business journal than the prodigal, immensely wealthy father magnanimously presenting a giant, novelty-sized check to a brilliant young student? The fact that the student was his own estranged biological son was the ultimate marketing coup. It was a fabricated narrative of familial triumph designed to completely erase 8 years of deliberate neglect. He was essentially purchasing public absolution for $50,000, a bargain basement price for a clean corporate conscience, and a highly lucrative press release. He had even invited 2 of his biggest potential investors to sit in the rows directly behind him, ensuring they witnessed his benevolent act firsthand. "And so," the principal boomed, his voice swelling with a manufactured, theatrical emotion, "it is my distinct and profound honor to invite our grant recipient to the stage, a young man of extraordinary vision, unyielding dedication, and limitless potential. Please welcome Leo." The heavy maroon velvet curtains parted. My breath hitched violently in my throat. Out walked my son. He was tall, his shoulders broad under the dark green graduation gown, moving with a quiet, fiercely grounded confidence that had been forged in the grease, toxic fumes, and freezing air of our makeshift garage laboratory. He looked radiant, a solitary, undeniable figure of genuine substance stepping into a cavernous room built entirely on fragile facades. The thunderous applause washed over him, echoing off the high ceilings, but he was completely indifferent to the cheering crowd. His eyes immediately darted downward, scanning the velvet-roped section with laser precision, searching for row 1, seat A. He was looking for the sacred reward he had so proudly secured for me. I watched from the heavy shadows as the bright anticipation on his face collided violently with the ugly reality of the front row. His gaze locked onto the designated seat. He saw the shimmering, $3,000 designer silk dress. He saw Meredith sitting there, wearing a tight, aggressively artificial smile for the benefit of the flashing cameras. He saw Julian beside her, holding the event program, entirely unbothered by the cruel displacement of his son's mother. The transformation in Leo was instantaneous and terrifying. The radiant, hopeful smile vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, hard, impenetrable stillness. His jaw clenched tight, the strong muscles working visibly beneath his youthful skin. He did not look heartbroken. He looked infinitely dangerous. Without missing a single step in his stride, Leo shifted his gaze. He looked past the blinding flashes of the camera bulbs, past the wealthy parents dripping in diamonds, past the exclusionary velvet ropes. He scanned the vast, dimly lit expanse of the auditorium, his eyes sweeping over the obscure corners and the forgotten standing areas. It took him only a few agonizing seconds to find me. Even in the gloom, completely surrounded by restless, standing strangers, our eyes finally met. Across the massive chasm of privilege, pretense, and stolen money, a silent, overwhelmingly powerful current passed between us. I stood perfectly still against the cold concrete pillar, clutching the terracotta pot with my black petunia so tightly my knuckles turned white. Leo held my gaze, his face unreadable to the masses, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of sorrow or defeat. It was a lethal confirmation. The final piece of our chessboard was set. Down in the VIP section, entirely oblivious to the silent, devastating exchange happening high above him, Julian proudly stood up. He adjusted the crisp lapels of his custom-tailored suit, shot his cuffs to perfectly display his excessively expensive watch, and buttoned his jacket with the smooth, arrogant grace of a reigning monarch. He turned toward the center aisle, his face meticulously arranged into an expression of deep, overwhelming paternal pride, fully prepared to step up onto that brightly lit stage and play the glorious role of the benevolent savior. He had absolutely no idea that he was walking straight into an execution. Leo reached the center of the stage. Down in the VIP aisle, Julian was already halfway up the wooden stairs, gripping the edge of a massive, absurdly large novelty check made of stiff foam board. The check had his corporate logo plastered prominently across the top in glossy blue ink. Julian stretched out his arms, arranging his face into a picture-perfect, benevolent grin, ready to capture the ultimate public relations photograph. Leo did not even break his stride. He walked straight past the outstretched board, completely ignoring the giant check, treating the wealthy chief executive officer like an invisible, pathetic obstacle. Julian froze, his manufactured smile twitching violently at the corners, left standing awkwardly near the podium, holding a useless piece of foam while his son claimed the microphone. Leo reached deep into the pocket of his dark green graduation gown and retrieved a small, unassuming black remote control. He did not look at the principal, nor did he look at his father. He simply aimed the device at the ceiling and pressed a single button. Behind him, the massive motorized theater screen began its slow, humming descent, casting a wide shadow over the brightly lit stage. Another click. The projector flared to life, throwing a brilliant, blinding white rectangle across the darkened space. Intricate, highly detailed engineering schematics flooded the screen. They were incredibly complex blueprints, a dizzying maze of precise geometric lines, fluid dynamic calculations, and mechanical cross-sections. It was the architectural anatomy of his senior project, a revolutionary, low-cost water filtration turbine designed to operate entirely off the grid. The sheer sophistication of the design immediately commanded the room. A sudden, sharp intake of breath echoed from the science faculty sitting in the second row. Leo leaned into the microphone. His voice, amplified by the towering speakers, was not shaking. It rang out with a sharp, metallic clarity that sliced straight through the thick, perfumed air of the auditorium. I was once called a reject by my own biological father. The collective gasp from the audience was audible. It was an ugly, brutal sentence that violently shattered the polite, sterile decorum of the evening. Down in the front row, Meredith let out a quiet, shocked noise, her manicured hand flying to her throat. Julian's face turned the color of wet ash. "I was told I was a bad investment," Leo continued, his tone perfectly level, completely devoid of self-pity. He possessed the absolute chilling authority of someone who had survived a massive fire and was now holding the torch. But this project behind me, this system that can purify hundreds of gallons of water without an external power source, was not built with a trust fund. It was not financed by the soulless, public relations-driven money of any corporate sponsor. It was not bought. He pressed the remote again. The pristine, clinical blueprints vanished. In their place, a raw, gritty, low-resolution time-lapse video began to play. The glamorous auditorium was suddenly bathed in the flickering, erratic light of a welding torch. The footage showed the interior of our drafty, uninsulated garage. It was pitch black outside the small frosted window, the digital timestamp in the corner reading 3 o'clock in the morning in the dead of winter. The video was a frantic, sped-up documentation of our reality. There I was, projected 20 feet high for the entire elite world to witness. I was wearing a bulky, grease-stained protective suit, my hair tied back in a messy knot, a heavy welding mask pulled down over my face. The audience watched in absolute silence as the giant projection of me hunched over a heavy steel workbench, sparks raining down on my thick canvas gloves as I fused the main housing of the turbine. The footage sped rapidly through the nights. It showed Leo and me covered in black oil, our hands black with soot, piecing together the complex rotors. It showed me collapsing against the concrete wall in sheer physical exhaustion, drinking cheap instant coffee from a battered thermos, before wiping my face and picking up the soldering iron yet again. It was an undeniable, visceral testament to raw survival. The contrast between the wealthy attendees sitting in velvet chairs and the filthy, freezing reality flashing on the screen was violently jarring. The video paused on a final frame of us tightening the last heavy bolt, our faces smeared with grease but glowing with an unmistakable, triumphant joy. Leo stepped out from behind the heavy wooden podium. He walked to the very edge of the stage, his piercing gaze sweeping over the sea of horrified, captivated faces, completely bypassing the expensive seats at the front. He raised his arm and pointed his finger straight down the center aisle, aiming directly into the dark, sweltering shadows at the very back of the hall where I stood trembling. "This machine," Leo's voice boomed, raw and shaking with a fierce, protective fury, "was created by a woman who drove a heavy industrial forklift for 12 hours a day. She broke her back and bled through her work gloves to buy every single screw, every inch of copper wire, and every piece of scrap metal for me." The entire auditorium went dead silent. It was the kind of absolute, ringing silence that follows a massive bomb detonation. Not a single person coughed. Not a single silk dress rustled. The local press reporters, who had been frantically snapping pictures of Julian just moments before, slowly lowered their heavy cameras. The flashing strobe lights abruptly ceased. One by one, the journalists physically turned their bodies away from the stage and pivoted toward the VIP section. They stared at Julian. The manufactured reverence in their eyes was entirely gone, replaced by a sharp, predatory suspicion and profound shock. The perfectly constructed facade of the benevolent tech billionaire was cracking right down the middle, and the entire room was watching it shatter. The suffocating silence that held the room hostage was suddenly shattered by the sharp, ugly screech of a wooden chair scraping violently against the polished floorboards. Meredith leaped to her feet right in the middle of the cordoned VIP section. The carefully cultivated image of the poised high society designer completely evaporated. Her face, usually a canvas of expensive cosmetics and serene indifference, was mottled with an angry, blotchy red. The veins in her neck strained against her heavy diamond necklace. "This is completely absurd," she shrieked, her voice cracking under the strain of sudden public humiliation. She pointed a shaking finger toward the stage, her composure completely gone. "You are an incredibly ungrateful child. After everything Julian has done to set up this grant, you stand up there and spit on his generosity. You are completely delusional. This is her doing. Your bitter, pathetic mother is manipulating you. She has brainwashed you into this ridiculous public stunt because she cannot handle her own miserable life. Her shrill accusations echoed terribly across the vast auditorium, bouncing off the acoustic panels. If Leo's presentation had shocked the elite crowd, Meredith's crude, hysterical outburst thoroughly appalled them. The unwritten rules of their social circle dictated that scandals were to be handled in quiet whispers behind closed doors, never screamed in a school auditorium. A wave of harsh, judging murmurs swept through the velvet chairs. Within seconds, the soft glow of dozens of smartphone screens illuminated the dark room. The same wealthy parents who had been politely clapping minutes earlier were now eagerly recording the catastrophic meltdown of a local socialite. The flash of the paparazzi cameras might have stopped, but the unforgiving lenses of high-definition smartphones were now capturing every single drop of her hysterical sweat. On the stage, the principal panicked. He lunged toward the podium, extending a hand to cut off the main audio feed and restore order to his ruined ceremony. But Julian was faster. Driven by the sheer, unadulterated terror of watching his multi-million-dollar public relations campaign burn to the ground, he abandoned his discarded foam check and sprinted up the remaining stairs. He practically shoved the principal aside and snatched the backup microphone from its heavy metal stand. Julian was a man accustomed to total control, but his physical tells betrayed his absolute panic. Heavy beads of sweat were pooling at his temples, ruining his expensive haircut. The collar of his custom-tailored shirt suddenly looked too tight. He turned to face the sea of glaring lenses, forcing his facial muscles into a ghastly plastic smile that did not reach his panicked, darting eyes. It was the desperate, terrifying grin of a cornered animal trying to mimic human warmth. "Please, everyone, please let us all just calm down," Julian commanded, his voice artificially smooth and dripping with a sickeningly fake paternal patience. He let out a forced, hollow chuckle that fell completely flat. We all know graduation is a highly emotional milestone. Leo is clearly just overwhelmed by the pressure of the evening and, frankly, the immense scale of this generous grant. He is confused. He paused, straightening his posture, desperately trying to reassert his dominance over the narrative. He gripped the microphone so tightly his knuckles turned white. Regardless of this little theatrical display, let us focus on the incredible science we just witnessed. As Leo's legal guardian and the primary financial provider for this family, I am incredibly proud. In fact, my technology firm will officially acquire the patent for this remarkable water filtration system next week. We will provide the massive capital needed to take his little garage project out of the dirt and push it into the global market. That is what a real father does. He builds the bridge for his son's future. The manipulation was smooth, practiced, and chillingly effective. I watched from the suffocating heat of the back corner as the energy in the room subtly shifted. The crowd of wealthy investors and corporate executives slowly began to nod in agreement. It was a narrative they understood and respected. The chaotic, emotional artist creates something messy, and the rational, wealthy businessman steps in to buy it, refine it, and monetize it. In their minds, Julian had successfully reclaimed his throne. He was the ultimate financial backer, the inevitable victor. My breath caught in my throat. My hands were shaking so violently, I had to press the cold terracotta pot against my chest to steady myself. The heavy, rhythmic pounding of my own heartbeat filled my ears, drowning out the murmurs of the crowd. Julian had played his strongest card, relying on the sheer weight of his corporate authority to crush the truth. I kept my eyes locked on the stage, watching my son stand perfectly still under the blinding spotlight, holding my breath as I waited for the final move. Leo did not look panicked. He did not look intimidated by the sudden display of aggressive corporate authority. Instead, standing under the harsh glare of the stage spotlight, holding the small black remote in his hand, my son tilted his head back and let out a genuine, ringing laugh. It was a bright, joyous sound that cut cleanly through the heavy tension of the room, completely disarming Julian's manufactured dominance. "You cannot buy it, Julian," Leo said, his voice echoing with absolute, unwavering certainty. "Your legal team should have done a basic background check before you tried to hijack this ceremony, because a minor cannot independently file and hold a registered commercial patent in this state." Leo pressed the button on his remote one final time. The gritty, fast-forwarded video of our freezing garage disappeared from the massive drop-down screen. It was instantly replaced by a stark, high-resolution scan of a highly official legal document. The crest of the United States Patent and Trademark Office sat prominently at the top header. The text was large, bold, and entirely undeniable. It was the approved, finalized registration for the revolutionary water filtration turbine. The audience collectively leaned forward, their eyes scanning the projected paperwork. Right there, highlighted under the section designating the sole legal owner and primary co-inventor, was a name printed in stark black ink. It did not say Julian. It did not say Leo. It read, Delilah Cook. It was my maiden name, the name I had proudly taken back the minute the divorce papers were finalized 8 years ago. Julian squinted at the giant screen, his brain frantically trying to process the legal jargon. As the reality of the document slowly dawned on him, the false color drained entirely from his face, leaving behind a sickening, translucent gray. His hands began to tremble so violently he nearly dropped the backup microphone. "And here is the real issue for your public relations campaign," Leo continued, his voice dropping into a smooth conversational tone that carried a lethal edge. "My mother is not selling this patent to your technology firm. Not next week. Not ever. In fact, she secured the intellectual property rights months ago. And just this morning, at exactly 9 o'clock, she formally signed a massive, exclusive licensing contract. But she did not sign it with you." Leo paused, letting the silence stretch tightly across the massive hall. He locked eyes with his father, delivering the final, devastating blow. "She signed the exclusive global rights over to Horizon Global." The name dropped like a physical anvil in the middle of the auditorium. Even from the back, I heard the sharp collective gasps from the venture capitalists sitting in the second row. Horizon Global was not just a competitor. They were the aggressive, massive conglomerate that was currently in the middle of executing a ruthless, highly publicized, hostile takeover of Julian's struggling company. Julian desperately needed the public relations boost of this water turbine to secure the funding that would save him from the buyout. Instead, I had just handed the ultimate weapon directly to his executioners. I had given Horizon Global the exact revolutionary technology they needed to completely render Julian's entire product line obsolete, finalizing the destruction of his empire. Julian's knees literally gave out beneath him. The microphone slipped from his slick, sweating fingers and hit the wooden stage floor with a deafening, sharp feedback screech. He stumbled backward down the stage stairs, his polished shoes slipping, and fell heavily into seat 1B. He collapsed into the velvet chair, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, a broken man realizing his entire career, his carefully hoarded wealth, and his public standing were now firmly resting in the calloused, scarred hands of the ex-wife he had so arrogantly discarded. Beside him, the furious energy completely left Meredith. She slumped forward in her $3,000 silk dress, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as she sobbed in pure, unadulterated public humiliation. Leo calmly reached over to the wooden podium. He picked up his leather-bound graduation diploma. He held it up high for the cameras that were now frantically recording him again. "By the way," Leo announced, his voice ringing with fierce, independent pride, "the name printed on this diploma is Leo Cook. I legally dropped your last name the morning of my 18th birthday. I do not want your money. I do not want your fake charity. And I certainly do not want your legacy." He placed the giant foam check for $50,000 face down on the floor of the stage. He turned his back on the VIP section, stepped down from the bright platform, and began to walk. The crowd of wealthy parents, investors, and teachers instinctively parted for him, creating a wide, clear path down the center aisle. He completely ignored the front rows. He did not look at the sobbing woman or the ruined man. He walked with long, purposeful strides, moving away from the suffocating world of plastic wealth and heading straight into the dark, sweltering shadows at the very back of the auditorium. He walked straight to me. When he reached the standing area, the stern, impenetrable mask he had worn on stage completely dissolved. He was just my boy again. I handed him the terracotta pot holding the rare black petunia, the flower that had finally bloomed after 6 months in the dark, just like he had. Leo took the flower with his left hand and used his right arm to pull me into a fierce, overwhelming embrace. I buried my face in his green graduation gown, the tears I had swallowed for 8 long years finally breaking free, soaking into the fabric. Then, the sound began. It started with a single, slow clap from one of the science teachers. Then another joined in, and another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium of 500 guests rose to their feet. The sound swelled into a massive, deafening roar of a standing ovation. They were not cheering for the billionaire. They were not cheering for the corporate sponsor. 500 wealthy elites were standing up, clapping until their hands hurt, looking past the velvet ropes to honor the solitary woman in the worn-out thrift store blazer and the scuffed shoes. We stood together in the darkest corner of the room, bathed in the thunderous applause of an absolute, undeniable victory. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Haley Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.